Back in 2003, the British government sent out an email asking for people to go to Iraq for 3 months to administer the country before we handed it back to the Iraqis. I was against the war, but I volunteered to go because I thought this would be my opportunity to apologize to Iraqis for the war and to help them rebuild their country. I had spent the preceding decade working in Israel-Palestine, helping build up the institutions of the Palestinian Authority and strengthening relations between Israelis and Palestinians. So I thought I had some skills to offer. But before I left for Iraq in 2003, I didn't receive a briefing from the British government, and I didn't know what my job was going to be. All I had was one phone call. The phone call said, "Find your way to RAF Brize Norton, get on a military plane, get to Basra, where you'll be met by somebody holding a sign with your name on it, and taken to the nearest hotel." Well, it sounded plausible. It was June 2003. The invasion was 3 months prior. The war was apparently over. I assumed that the British government knew what it was doing, it just hadn't told me. So I arrived in Basra, and I quickly discovered that there was nobody waiting to meet me. Nobody expected me. There was no sign with my name on it. So I spent my first night sleeping in Basra airport with tons and tons of British soldiers who were all stripped down to their underwear. It was 50-degree heat. And I thought, what am I going to do here? There's nothing for me to do here. So I found a plane going the next day up to Baghdad airport. I flew to Baghdad, and from there I made my way to the Republican Palace, which was the headquarters of the Coalition Provisional Authority. So I turned up and I said, "Hello, I'm Emma from England, come to volunteer." And I was pleased to find there was a list with my name on it. That was reassuring. I received my first briefing from a British colonel who told me that Iraq was stable. He said, "The greatest threat to you will be from trigger-happy American soldiers." That was less reassuring. So after a week in Baghdad, I was told that there were enough people there that I should try the north. So I flew up to Mosul, but there was somebody there, and I kept on going. And I finally got to Kirkuk, where I was told I was the senior civilian responsible for the province, reporting directly to Ambassador Bremer, who was the head of the Coalition Provisional Authority. It's like, wow. I had never run a town before, let alone been a governor of a province in a foreign country. But I realized that Iraqis took my job quite seriously when, during my first week, insurgents tried to assassinate me. Insurgents came in the middle of the night to the house where I was staying in the middle of town, and they fired 5 rockets into it. Fortunately, it was a well-built house, and one of the rockets, which came up into the room where I was in bed, the explosion was taken out in the ceiling. So later that morning, I went to the Kirkuk government building, which was supposed to be the headquarters of the provincial government. But it was swarming with US soldiers who had taken over every room in the building and put signs up with a unit's name on it. I had never really had any interaction with the military before, let alone the US military. But I did what you're told to do whenever you arrive in a foreign country. I grabbed hold of a soldier and I said to him, "Take me to your chief." So the soldier says, "Come with me, ma'am." So I follow him up the stairs to this very large office, which previously had been that of the governor of Kirkuk. And I walked in, and I found American Colonel Mabel, lounging on the couch with his feet up. I introduced myself, and I said, "Colonel, it's all slightly embarrassing and awkward, but my house has been blown up, and I need to find some accommodation. Any chance you might have a spare tent on the airfield?" And the colonel sat up, snarled, and poking a finger in the air said, "We're going to hunt those people down." "Colonel," I said, completely horrified, "you are to do no such thing. They're attacking me because they see me as a symbol of an illegal occupation. All I request from you is a tent, not a death warrant on my attackers." So I left his office furious. But I soon received information that a tent had been made available to me on the airfield. But when I went to it later, what they hadn't told me was it already had 7 men in it. So I returned the next day to Colonel Mavell's office, carrying with me my laptop. I put it down on his desk and I drew up a chair next to his. I had downloaded the 4th Geneva Convention, and I proceeded to read it to him line by line. "Colonel," I said, "if I find you in violation of any of these articles, I will take you to The Hague." Now, it was early days, and I didn't know at this stage that you couldn't take Americans to The Hague, and the American hadn't signed up to the International Criminal Court. Anyway, Colonel Mavell, much to my surprise, actually greeted my arrival in Kirkuk with great enthusiasm, as he viewed me as his replacement, the first of the civilian team to replace the military. He and his paratroopers had jumped into northern Iraq a few months prior. They were tired and they wanted to go home. So Mavell announced that he and I would share his office in the government building, that he would take me around the province and introduce me to everybody before he departed. And so began quite an unlikely partnership. Mavell and I realized we had the same goal, to get Kirkuk back on its feet, with Iraqis running their own affairs so that the US military could leave. And the more I got to know Mavell, I realized we had shared values, that he had a wicked sense of humor, and that we had read the same books. And Mavell wanted to learn from me everything that I knew about the Middle East. Well, it soon became clear that I wasn't the first of the civilians to arrive. I was actually it. And so I spent every day meeting with different groups of Iraqis, listening to their fears and grievances, and mediating between them. So let me just tell you a little bit about Kirkuk. Kirkuk is a multi-ethnic, multicultural province. It's home to Arabs, Kurds, Turkoman, Sunni, Shia, Christians, Kakai, Yazidi. It's also got oil. And the Ba'ath Party had tried to Arabize the province by expelling Kurds and importing Arabs from the south. And in the aftermath of the overthrow of Saddam's regime, there was a struggle for control of the province, with Kurds seeking to annex it to Kurdistan, and with the other communities trying to prevent this from happening. But I was struck by how the different communities intermarried, how they spoke each other's languages, how they loved each other's cultures. So in an attempt to diffuse tensions, I organized a cultural event at the Kirkuk Museum. For one evening, many of the artifacts that had been looted from the museum and were being kept in people's houses were returned and put on display. And groups put on traditional performances. The night culminated with everyone spontaneously coming forward to dance the dabka hand in hand together in a long line. And one Iraqi politician jumped up and said, "This is Kirkuk. This is who we are." It's a night I will always remember. And so on the ground in Kirkuk, we were successful at empowering local leaders, at mediating between and balancing the competing groups. But decisions had been taken way above our heads at the national level, which had a devastating impact on the whole country. A month before I arrived in Kirkuk, the coalition had dissolved the Ba'ath Party and dismissed the security institutions. And in so doing, it had removed the very sinews of the state that held the country together. And in the resulting power vacuum, Iraqis formed gangs, militias and insurgent groups flourished, and this led to a breakdown of order and Iraq's descent into civil war. And I still remember my first week in Baghdad when I'd gone downtown and I was struck by all the looting. And an Iraqi man walked past me and he said in Arabic, Alam Hobsi, this is a Hobbesian world. And I looked at him perplexed. Hobbes, Hobbes, he repeated, obviously wondering who was this foreigner and why didn't she know about Hobbes. And I was left wondering, who is this Iraqi man and how does he know about Hobbes? And it was Hobbes that had written that in the absence of the state and the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Wind forward a couple of years to late 2006, and I had just returned back to the UK after a tour in Afghanistan. When out of the blue, I received an email from General Odierno, an American general, asking me would I return to Iraq to be his political advisor. I had met General Odierno during my time in Kirkuk, as he had been Colonel Mayville's boss. And now he'd appointed to be the commander of US troops in Iraq for the surge. Now, I did what any sensible person would have done. I ignored the email and pretended it had gone to my spam. Well, that didn't last very long, because as a general, he's also got lots and lots of people working for him. And sure enough, within a few hours, a photo of my house in Battersea appeared on Google Earth with rockets pointing down at it. So back I went to Iraq at the beginning of 2007. And when I arrived, first meeting with General Odierno, he said to me that he wanted me to accompany him wherever he went. He said I had a very different perspective from the military, and he wanted to understand that perspective. He said during his first tour in Iraq, he had learnt the limitations of military force. And he told me that he wanted me to tell him whenever he was screwing up. And I thought, perfect job for me. So the levels of violence in Iraq at this time was simply horrific, and everyone felt that the country was lost. My main focus during this period was trying to understand what was driving instability in Iraq. Who were all these different armed groups? Why were they fighting? Why were they using violence? How could we get them to stop? Now, the military was used to identifying and targeting the enemy. And so it required a change of mindset to actually stop, to try and understand who were these different armed groups and what did they want, particularly difficult as they were killing our soldiers. And the Iraqi government was hugely suspicious that the US military was doing deals with these armed groups which sought the overthrow of the new government. Now, I found an unexpected ally in my endeavors. Her name was Dr. Bassema. She wore hijab and heels. She was a rocket science from Sadr City in Baghdad. And she was the military advisor to the Iraqi Prime Minister, only in Iraq. Now, Dr. Bassema and I saw each other as two kindred spirits. We were both female of a similar age and working with the military. And we understood that the different groups in Iraq were competing for power and resources. And we both believed that the only way to end the violence was through reconciliation, and that most groups could be brought into the process. It was only the most extreme, the ones that wanted to collapse the nation-state and create the caliphate, that could not. And so we helped our respective bosses, the general and the prime minister, reach agreement on the way ahead. And the Sunni awakening grew and flourished. They turned against al-Qaeda and brought about a huge drop in the casualty figures. And so the surge was an extraordinary period. The US military changed its tactics to focus on population security, outreach to insurgent groups, and precisely targeting those who they deemed irreconcilable. The surge helped bring about a shift in the strategic calculus of the different Iraqi groups. They stopped using violence. And the US military brokered ceasefires and truces between the competing groups. We hoped that elections in 2010 would bring about a political settlement and power sharing, and that would set Iraq irreversibly on the path towards stability. So what went wrong? Why did it all unravel? The turnout for the 2010 elections was high. Iraqis wanted to believe in the political process. They were hopeful that they could move beyond sectarianism. They had had enough of religious parties. Iraqia, a coalition led by Ayad Alawi, who was a secular Shia, campaigned on a platform of no to sectarianism, an Iraq for all Iraqis. And this message really resonated. This platform attracted support from Iraq's Sunnis, secular Shia, and minorities. And it won most of the seats in the elections. And the incumbent Prime Minister Maliki, refused to accept that he had lost the elections. He demanded a recount. And he sought to use de-Baathification to disqualify Iraqi candidates and annul their votes. He intimidated his rivals. He pressured the judiciary to rule in his favor. But none of this could change the election results. And still he sat in his seat and refused to give up power. Now, there were differences within the US system over what to do. My boss, the general, believed that the US should uphold the right of the winning bloc to have first go at trying to form the government. However, in the end, Vice President Biden decided that the US would give support to Nouri al-Maliki for a second term. And he did this because he believed that Maliki was a friend of the US, would give the US a follow-on security agreement to keep troops in Iraq, and he thought he was an Iraqi nationalist. But Iraqi politicians had spent the previous 2 years trying to remove Maliki from power through a vote of no confidence in parliament because they were fearful that he was becoming a dictator. And no matter how much pressure that the Americans put on the different political parties to support Maliki, the Iraqi coalition adamantly refused and said it was their right to have first go at trying to form the government. Iran, in the meantime, sensed this was their opportunity to step forward and broker the formation of government, putting pressure on Maliki's arch rivals, the Sadrists, to support him for a second term. And the condition was that all US troops should depart Iraq at the end of 2011. And so in the region, people spoke about how Iran drove America out of Iraq, or how the US had handed Iraq to Iran on a silver platter. And securing his seat for a second term, Maliki went after the Sunni politicians, accusing them of terrorism and driving them out of the political process. He reneged on the promises that were made to the tribal leaders who had fought against al-Qaeda in Iraq. Masses of Sunnis were arrested. And Maliki subverted the democratic institutions that had been set up to provide a check on the power of the executive. Sunni protests were violently crushed. And in such an environment, the Islamic State was able to rise up out of the ashes of al-Qaeda in Iraq. And the Sunni tribes that had previously fought against al-Qaeda in Iraq looked at ISIS, and they thought it was the lesser of two evils when compared with Maliki's Iranian-backed sectarian regime. So I went back to Iraq last summer after ISIS had swept into Mosul. And the Iraqi army which had greatly outnumbered ISIS, had fled, leaving behind all their US-supplied equipment. Maliki had replaced those military commanders who he regarded as too close to the US military with people who were loyal to him. And these guys had pocketed the money that was supposed to be used to buy ammunition and food for the troops, and no orders had been given to the Iraqi army to fight. We shouldn't have invaded Iraq in 2003. But nothing that happened in Iraq after 2003 was inevitable. There were potential different futures for Iraq. There were hopes for a world without Saddam Hussein and missed opportunities to create a better order. We have seen the unintended consequences of our action as well as our non-action. We remain so traumatized by the Iraq war that we have stood by while mass murder has taken place in Syria and millions have been displaced from their homes. I hope my book, The Unravelling, contributes to a better understanding of what happened in Iraq so that we can learn, heal, and re-examine who we are and what we stand for. I hope the book will help us better understand the limitations of external actors in foreign lands, but also where it is we can have influence and what it is we can do to make our world safer and more peaceful for everyone. Thank you.